And hello once again, my name is Lupus, and today I'm just going to be doing a very, very brief discussion about eco-criticism. Okay, now before we get into that, if you appreciate these videos that I make, you can support my stuff, if you so desire, by checking out my Patreon or reading some of my books. But let's get on to eco-criticism. So, what is eco-criticism? Now, I'm also just going to first say, this is something that I did not do this particular theory in a lot of depth, and so I thought I'd just be a very, very small, sort of brief primer about it for anyone who has the briefest of an inkling of a, just the briefest inkling of a thought about possibly pursuing this concept. So, just what is it? In very simple terms, eco-criticism is generally something that it's a form of literary criticism, a lot of the time, that focuses on the ecology of the world in some sense. It is interrogating the relationship between humans and the environment, that human beings are inherently part of the environment. Because in a lot of different types of theoretical understandings, especially more Western viewpoints, humans see themselves as distinct from the environment. We live in the environment, but we're not actually part of the environment. When we are animals that live within this world. If the world it gets destroyed, so do we. We are also affected by it, and this has obviously become more and more understandable and relatable to people as things like the inevitability of climate change has become a bigger and bigger thing in our lives. So essentially, eco-criticism is looking at that, right? How do humans relate to the environment? Now, there is a lot of variation in definitions of eco-criticism. So, for instance, I remember, because I know ecofeminism very, very well. It's an area that I've studied extensively. And I remember, problem is I can't remember who it was, but I remember a person basically saying they call themselves an eco-critic because when they call themselves an eco-feminist, basically people are less likely to take them seriously because people don't know the concept as well as eco-criticism. But they say that eco-criticism is ecofeminism. So you get people who do say things like that. But yeah. So let's also first just talk about here how different people define eco-criticism differently. And people sort of disagree about what eco-criticism is, what it encompasses. Some people see it very, very broad. Some people see it much, much less. But essentially, the basic idea is that it is looking at the ecology and humans in their relationship with the ecology of this planet, right? That we are animals, we're part of nature, all of that kind of stuff. Now, and a very important thing to note is the very, very problematic history of sort of a Western prevalence in eco-critical thought. So, the earliest eco-critics, just like with a lot of these Western originating sort of concepts, is that they tend to have this preference for Western. It's not necessarily an active, willful refusal to sort of pay attention to other cultures, but more that it comes from not realizing that you're excluding. So you'll for instance get a lot of this is like criticism that you'll get directed towards some like ecofeminists and stuff, that they are often criticizing that culture doesn't care about animals and nature and everything, when really it's just Western culture that doesn't. And a lot of the time, the ideas that can be found in eco-criticism, ecofeminism, things like that, already exist in just other cultures that are basically not white cultures. So Native American cultures, various Asian cultures, they had a much more nature-centered perspective way before white people did. And so it's almost like this idea of, oh, you see, we now care about the environment and we're going to pretend like it's an important thing that we are now realizing and nobody else has ever realized, which is a very, very Eurocentric perspective to have, and a problem that was in eco-criticism, ecofeminism, all of those kind of things. But there is a much more diversity in thought now than there used to be. And that is good. That is a good thing, obviously. That is a very good thing. So, but that is something to keep in mind. Don't try and see it just from this Western perspective. You need to understand that these ideas are not exactly only in eco-criticism. They can be found all over the place. Now, by its very nature, eco-criticism is interdisciplinary. It looks at lots of things. So I put a couple of things here. Eco-poetics, which is basically poetics about ecology, which they usually just say poetry, but poetics can also refer to just literature in general. So I would rather have it have a more general definition, also looking at ecology, sustainability, environmentalism, and cultural studies. So very, very broad, right? Because it's sort of saying we're going to look at books and poems and plays about the environment. We're going to look at the ecology itself. We're going to look at the idea of sustainability. We're going to look at things like the environmentalist movement. And we're going to look at how culture has effects on the environment. Different cultures and how they influence and change things. And these are all possible things that you could interrogate through an eco-critical lens. You could say, I'm going to look at books that are about nature in some way. Now, that doesn't mean the book has to be about protecting nature. A book in which the natural world gets destroyed, like post-apocalyptic media, is inherently, partially sort of eco-literature, because the world gets destroyed, nature gets destroyed, and usually, say for instance, when like there's mutant animals and stuff, the animals themselves, nature, is rebelling against what was done to it. It is eco-literature, fundamentally. And you can interrogate that from that perspective, even though you might not see it that way when you just look at it. When you play a Fallout game, you might think, oh, this is mostly about capitalism and stuff, but look at all the mutant animals that happened because of what we did to the environment, and the world is completely destroyed, so why is it, the way it is? And that is possibly, an eco-poetic and eco-critical perspective that you can have on those things. The ecology, also, very important. Looking at the way that we talk about and interrogate the ecology and the natural world that is around us, and of course how we try to sustain it, because sustainability is fundamentally about living in a harmony with something without essentially destroying it. So looking at what that means and our relationship to that, and whether environmentalism, its goals are necessarily worth following, in how they're worth following, because obviously environmentalism is a good thing, but how, like, what kind of tactics are being used to encourage it or to try and force it. These things can be looked at from an eco-critical perspective. Also, of course, cultural studies, how do different cultures do this? So, but the last little thing I put here is that literature that is analyzed in eco-criticism is very, very broad, right? The earlier stuff was often about like romanticism and nature writing, which often loved to look at the natural world. But as I just said, you can look at like post-apocalyptic media. You can look at postmodern stuff and sort of say that is also looking at the ecology in a specific way. So, yeah, there are many different ways in which you can apply eco-criticism. Now, I won't call myself an expert on eco-criticism. I basically mostly went into animal studies, which there are certain relations between eco-criticism and animal studies, because by caring about the animals, you have to inherently care about the natural world. So there is an aspect there, but they're not necessarily, they're not the same area of study at all, but they have relationships with one another. But yeah, so this is just a very, very brief sort of what is eco-criticism in a very, very broad nutshell kind of way. And if it is something that you want to interrogate further and look into, because it is interesting. I just haven't looked into it as much. And yeah, that is where I'm going to pretty much end things here. Very, very brief, very, very short video in terms of a lot of my kind of stuff that I make. And yeah, so hopefully, if this was helpful as a little thing, if you appreciate the kind of stuff that I make, you can support me if you so desire on places like Patreon or by checking out my books. Or, of course, you can do the usual things, the like, comment, subscribe, that kind of boring nonsense. That is usually good for the algorithm and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, that's about it. Otherwise, have a great day, week, and month ahead. Goodbye.